When my parents announced their divorce, I didn't cry. Not immediately, at least. The shock hit me in waves, each one heavier than the last. By the time I realized I was sinking, Scott had already stepped in, hauling me to the surface before I could even think to ask for help. Scott had always been my cousin, my partner in crime during family holidays, and the one who smuggled me extra slices of pie at Thanksgiving. But now, at 34, he had become something else entirely, my lifeline. When Mom moved to Florida to find herself and Dad relocated for work, Scott offered me a place in his loft without hesitation. The transition was jarring. His apartment was modern, spotless, and nothing like the cozy chaos of my childhood home. I felt like a mismatched puzzle piece wedged into his life. But Scott never made me feel out of place. "You'll get used to it," he said one evening as I stood awkwardly in his kitchen, eyeing the gleaming countertops. "It's not home yet, but it can be." Despite his reassurance, I struggled to settle in. I threw myself into swimming, my one constant. Every morning, before the city stirred, I was at the community pool. The water was my refuge, a place where I could dive deep and leave my worries behind, if only for a little while. Scott, meanwhile, adapted to his new role as my reluctant guardian with surprising ease. He worked long hours as a project manager, but he always found time to check in on me. At first, his care felt like overcompensation. He'd text me reminders to eat lunch or ask how my swim went, as though trying to fill the gaps my parents had left behind. But Scott's life wasn't as seamless as he made it seem. I caught glimpses of his struggles. The furrowed brow as he juggled phone calls, the takeout containers piling up on the counter when he was too tired to cook. One night, I heard him pacing in the living room long after I'd gone to bed. "Are you okay?" I asked the next morning as we passed each other in the hallway. "Yeah," he said, his smile tight. "Just a lot on my plate." We were learning to navigate this new normal together, though not without hiccups. Like the time I accidentally shrank his favorite sweater in the wash, or when he reorganized the kitchen cabinets, and I couldn't find the coffee for a week. Our routines began to overlap in small but significant ways. I'd come home from the pool to find him tinkering with his bike on the balcony. We started sharing meals, mostly pasta or stir-fries, and watched the occasional movie together. It wasn't a seamless transition, but it was comfortable. One evening, after a particularly long day, I found Scott in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with an intensity that suggested more than just hunger. "Everything okay?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Work stuff," he muttered. "It's fine." I didn't press him, but later, as we sat on the couch watching an old sitcom, I noticed the tension in his shoulders had eased. He glanced over at me and smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reminded me of the Scott I'd grown up with. "Thanks for putting up with me," he said out of nowhere. I blinked. "Shouldn't I be saying that to you?" He chuckled, reaching for the remote. "Fair enough." It wasn't a dramatic moment, but it stuck with me. For all his effort to be my rock, Scott was human too, navigating his own uncertainties while trying to keep me steady. A few days later, I came home to find a note on the fridge. "Good luck with your swim tomorrow. Don't forget breakfast." It wasn't much, just a scrap of paper with his familiar scrawl, but it made me smile. And that's how it started. Not with a kiss or a declaration, but with a series of small, quiet gestures that began to weave themselves into the fabric of our lives. Living with Scott was like navigating a delicate balancing act. We had our routines, our rhythms, and unspoken agreements that made sharing a home bearable, even comforting. But beneath the surface, there was something neither of us was willing to acknowledge, an undercurrent that only grew stronger with time. That particular evening, I returned from my swim feeling the satisfying ache of overworked muscles and the familiar sting of chlorine lingering on my skin. The pool had always been my sanctuary, a place where the repetitive motion of cutting through water drowned out the noise in my head. But lately, even that hadn't been enough. The apartment was quiet when I stepped inside, save for the faint hum of the city outside. Scott was on the balcony, silhouetted against the amber glow of the streetlights. His posture was relaxed, one arm draped casually over the railing, but something about him seemed distant. I set my bag down and wandered toward him, drawn by an inexplicable pull. Scott didn't move at first, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The lights of the city twinkled like stars, and the faint murmur of life below filled the silence. For a while, I simply stood there, letting the stillness settle between us. There was a kind of intimacy in that silence, one I wasn't sure how to break. Scott finally glanced my way, his expression soft but unreadable. His eyes held a heaviness I hadn't noticed before, a weight I realized he'd been carrying for a long time. Something shifted inside me then, an ache I couldn't quite place. Scott had always been my rock, the steady presence I could lean on when everything else felt uncertain. But tonight he seemed vulnerable. I wanted to reach out, to say something that would lighten the load I knew he carried, but words felt inadequate. Instead, I moved closer, resting my hand on the railing beside his. The distance between us narrowed, and with it, the air grew charged. The moment felt suspended, like the world had paused just for us. I became acutely aware of everything. The faint scent of his cologne, the warmth radiating from him, the rhythmic rise and fall of his breath. When he turned to face me fully, the intensity in his gaze caught me off guard. It wasn't just the familiar kindness, or the quiet concern I was used to seeing. There was something else, something deeper, unspoken, and impossible to ignore. My heart pounded, each beat a deafening drum in my chest. I wasn't sure who moved first, whether it was him leaning in or me closing the gap. All I knew was that the space between us disappeared, and then his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as though we were both testing the boundaries of something fragile. But as the seconds stretched, it deepened, carrying an urgency that neither of us could deny. His hand came up to cup my cheek, the warmth of his touch grounding me even as my thoughts scattered. The world seemed to fade, leaving only the sensation of his lips, the faint taste of beer on his breath, the way his thumb brushed against my skin. When we finally pulled apart, the silence between us was deafening. Scott's expression was a mix of emotions I couldn't quite decipher: regret, confusion, something dangerously close to longing. I stepped back, the cool night air rushing to fill the space he'd left. My chest felt tight, my thoughts a chaotic mess. Scott ran a hand through his hair, his movements tense, as though trying to wrestle his own emotions under control. Neither of us spoke. Words felt impossible in the face of what had just happened. Instead, Scott turned and walked back inside, leaving me alone on the balcony with the city lights and the weight of what we'd just done. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the kiss. I replayed it over and over, dissecting every moment, every sensation, every look that had passed between us. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the breaking point, the moment when everything we'd been pretending didn't exist came rushing to the surface. I told myself it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment we'd both forget by morning. But deep down I knew better. The kiss wasn't a mistake, it was inevitable. And now, there was no going back. The night pulsed with a rhythmic energy, the city's neon lights casting vibrant patterns on the pavement as we made our way to the nightclub. It was one of those places where time seemed to blur, the music loud enough to drown out coherent thought, and the air thick with the mingled scents of perfume and spilled drinks. Taylor, always the ringleader of our social outings, had insisted on the night out. She rallied a group of our mutual friends, promising it would be exactly what everyone needed. Scott had surprised me by agreeing to come along, though I wondered if he regretted it the moment we stepped into the cacophony of sound and color. The club was packed, bodies moving in chaotic unison under flashing lights. Scott and I followed Taylor to a reserved table near the edge of the dance floor, where the group had already begun to settle in with drinks and laughter. Scott took a seat beside me, his closeness impossible to ignore. The booth was cramped, and every slight movement, his arm brushing mine, his knee against my leg, sent a ripple of awareness through me. I tried to focus on the conversation around the table, on the stories and jokes being passed back and forth, but my mind kept circling back to him. The music seemed to amplify the tension between us, the heavy bass line thrumming in time with my racing pulse. I could feel the weight of his presence, the way his gaze occasionally lingered on me before flitting away. It was maddening, this unspoken connection that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. As the night wore on, the group grew livelier. Drinks flowed freely, loosening inhibitions and heightening the sense of camaraderie. Someone brought up the topic of relationships, a dangerous subject, given the charged silence between Scott and me. The others were perceptive, picking up on the subtle shifts in body language, the way our interactions had changed. There were knowing glances and teasing smiles, as if the group had collectively decided we were hiding something. It was a game to them, a mystery to unravel. And then, as the group pressed for answers, the moment came. Taylor, ever the keen observer, leaned closer, her expression laced with curiosity. She pointed out the unusual energy between us, her words met with laughter and nods of agreement from the others. The attention was palpable, the weight of their curiosity pressing against the fragile boundary Scott and I had been clinging to. The truth spilled out. Quietly, almost nonchalantly, it became clear that we'd kissed. The group's reaction was immediate, a mixture of shock, excitement, and amusement. They didn't need details. The fact of it was enough to fuel their speculation. The revelation hung in the air, its impact rippling through the group dynamic. For them, it was a piece of gossip, a new layer to dissect and tease. For us, it was a confession we couldn't take back. I avoided meeting Scott's eyes after that, focusing instead on the swirling patterns of the dance floor. Yet, even in the midst of the crowded club, the connection between us felt inescapable. By the time we left the club, the city had taken on a quieter energy, the streets glistening under dim streetlights. The group dispersed with laughter and goodbyes, each of them still buzzing from the night's revelations. Scott and I walked home in silence, the distance between us both physical and emotional. I felt the weight of the night pressing down on me, the unspoken questions and uncertainties lingering in the cool night air. The club had been a temporary escape, but now we were back in the real world, where the kiss and everything it implied couldn't be ignored. The fallout came quickly, like a storm breaking after days of oppressive stillness. It didn't take long for the ripple of truth to spread beyond our close-knit group. Friends talk, whispers grow, and soon enough, it felt like everyone knew, though no one said anything to my face. The looks were enough, curious, judgmental, or worst of all, pitying. At first, Scott and I avoided each other altogether. The tension in the apartment was suffocating. Mornings were marked by awkward silences, the faint sound of the coffee maker filling the void where our easy banter used to live. Evenings were worse. The apartment felt too small to hold the weight of everything unspoken. I didn't know how to bridge the gap, and maybe I didn't want to. A part of me felt betrayed, as though Scott had abandoned me in this whirlwind we'd created together. He was the one who had told the group about the kiss, after all, even if he'd tried to do it subtly. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the kiss, about the connection that lingered beneath all the chaos. One particularly bad night, the tension boiled over. It started with something trivial, a misplaced set of keys, a comment made in passing, but quickly spiraled into an argument that felt inevitable. Scott accused me of overthinking everything, of letting other people's opinions get to me. I shot back that he was the one who couldn't face the reality of what we'd done, that he was running away and leaving me to deal with the fallout alone. The words were sharp, cutting deeper than either of us probably intended, and by the end of it, we were both left raw and hurting. For the first time in weeks, I spent the night at a friend's place, needing the distance to breathe, to think. But even there, surrounded by familiar comforts, I couldn't escape the gnawing ache in my chest. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and introspection. I threw myself into swimming, pushing my body to its limits as if I could exhaust the thoughts swirling in my mind. Each lap in the pool felt like an attempt to escape, though I wasn't sure if I was running from Scott, from the truth, or from myself. Eventually, something shifted. It wasn't a grand realization or a sudden change, but rather a quiet acceptance that settled over me like the calm after a storm. I couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't take back the kiss or the feelings it had unearthed, but I could decide what came next. It was late one evening when I returned home, the apartment dimly lit and unusually quiet. Scott was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked up as I walked in, his expression unreadable but softened by the flicker of lamplight. I hesitated, the weight of everything we'd been through making it hard to move. But then, slowly, I crossed the room and sat down beside him. There were no accusations this time, no sharp words or defensiveness, just a quiet understanding that we were both tired of fighting, of avoiding, of pretending. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, laced with the vulnerability he so rarely showed. He admitted to his fear, of how others saw us, of what it all meant, of whether we could handle it. And then, with a clarity that cut through all the noise, he said he didn't want to lose me. His words hit me like a wave, washing away the doubt and hesitation I'd been clinging to. In that moment, I realized that I didn't want to lose him either. I leaned in first this time, the kiss soft and certain, a quiet affirmation of everything we couldn't put into words. It wasn't the kind of kiss that demanded answers or promised resolutions. It simply was, solid and grounding, tethering us to the present. When we pulled apart, there was no apology, no second-guessing. For the first time, it felt like we were on the same page, ready to face whatever came next, not for anyone else but for ourselves. The night stretched on as we sat together, the silence no longer heavy but comforting. There were still challenges ahead, still questions to answer and bridges to rebuild. But for now, we were enough. The days that followed our quiet reconciliation felt like a slow, unraveling of a tension that had suffocated us for so long. It wasn't perfect, not by any means. There were still moments when the weight of our secret hung heavily in the air, when our interactions felt like delicate steps on a tightrope, unsure of where they might lead. But there was also a sense of peace, a quiet, unspoken understanding between us that hadn't existed before. Scott and I found a new rhythm, one where we were both more mindful of each other, more open in the small ways that mattered. We started sharing more than just the mundane details of daily life. There were quiet moments on the couch, evenings spent together with no expectations, just the comfort of each other's presence. Sometimes we didn't need to say anything. A look, a touch, was enough to convey everything that words couldn't. Yet, the weight of our relationship remained, even in those moments of peace. We didn't talk about the kiss, at least, not directly, but it was always there, lingering in the spaces between us, unspoken but deeply felt. It was an undeniable part of our bond now, and despite everything, neither of us was willing to pretend it hadn't happened. One afternoon, when the city felt like it was basking in the warmth of an early summer, Scott suggested we take a day trip out of town. Just the two of us, no distractions, no pressure. I hesitated at first, wondering if it would be too soon, if it might reopen old wounds. But in the end, I agreed, knowing that sometimes the best way to move forward was to create new memories together. We drove for hours, the road winding through picturesque landscapes, the kind of views that seemed to stretch on forever. The change of scenery helped clear the air between us, giving us the space to be present in a way we hadn't been for a while. We talked, really talked, about the future, about our fears, and about what had brought us to this point. It was in these conversations that I realized how deeply connected we had become, how much we had both grown in such a short time. By the time we reached the small town we had planned to explore, the weight of our earlier struggles seemed far behind us. We wandered the streets, hand in hand, as if the world outside had no power to touch us. It was simple, uncomplicated, just us, navigating this new chapter together. Scott turned to me, his gaze soft but intense, and for a moment, I wondered if everything had led us here, if this was the moment that would define us. Without saying a word, he took my hand, and we sat there in silence, watching the sun fade into the horizon. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, but it was enough. We didn't need to label it, didn't need to know exactly what the future held. There was no rush, no expectation to have all the answers. All we needed was each other, and in that quiet moment, I realized that the rest of it, whatever came next, would fall into place. When we finally got back to the car, the drive home felt different. There was a sense of possibility in the air, a sense of freedom. The uncertainty that had once felt like a looming shadow no longer seemed so daunting. We had found something that was ours, something beyond the judgment of others, beyond the complexities of our past. The night before, I had wondered if this could really work, if we could truly be something more than the complications we created. But now, as I sat beside Scott, I realized that maybe the complications were part of the story, part of what made it real. Back at the apartment, when the door closed behind us, it felt like we were starting over. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, we were facing it together, two people who had found something worth fighting for, despite everything. And so in that small, quiet space, we sat side by side, knowing that whatever happened next, we were ready. The rest, we would figure out together. After everything. After the whispers, the judgment, the silences, I think Scott and I realized that we didn't need anyone else's approval. We didn't need to justify our love or our choices to anyone, least of all to people who weren't living our lives. What we had between us wasn't something we could easily explain, and maybe it wasn't something the world would ever understand. But it was ours, and that was all that mattered. One quiet morning, we found ourselves in a cafe, tucked away in the corner, sipping coffee in comfortable silence. We had been talking about it for a while, half joking about how it could be a way to reclaim some of the control over our own story. But today it felt different. Today the words between us no longer felt like just talk. There was a sense of resolve, of certainty, that had been missing before. We could do it, Scott said, his voice steady, though I could sense the weight of the decision in his tone. I looked at him, unsure at first of what he meant, and then it hit me. The thought we had been circling around for months, getting married. Just the two of us. A simple, quiet commitment, one that didn't need to be announced or explained to anyone but ourselves. There was no grand proposal, no public spectacle, just a shared understanding between us. We didn't need all the fanfare. All we needed was this moment, right here, right now. I nodded, feeling a rush of something I couldn't quite name. Part fear, part excitement, but mostly relief. It was a decision that felt like we were taking back control over the narrative of our relationship. It wasn't about the big gestures or the opinions of others. It was about us, finally choosing each other without hesitation. And so, the very next morning, we drove to the registry office. There was something surreal about the simplicity of it. The mundane office building, the unassuming surroundings, the paperwork that would change everything. But in that moment, it felt perfect. The two of us, in this small, quiet place, signing our names on a piece of paper that made it real. The ceremony, if you could even call it that, was brief. The registrar spoke the formal words, and we exchanged a look, one that said everything we couldn't put into words. There were no grand promises or elaborate vows, just the quiet exchange of a commitment that had grown between us over time, in the spaces where words fell short. And when it was over, when the ink on the certificate dried, when we stepped out into the world as something new, I couldn't help but smile. There was no audience, no applause, just the quiet certainty of what we had chosen, and a moment between us that felt like the culmination of everything we had gone through. Standing outside, Scott took my hand. Without a word, he pulled me closer, and for the first time in a long while, everything else melted away. The noise, the expectations, the doubts, all of it was gone. There was only this moment, and the future we were now stepping into, together. And then he kissed me. It was simple, but it felt like the most powerful declaration I had ever experienced. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a promise that no matter what came next, no matter how hard, how uncertain, or how challenging, we were choosing each other. That was all we needed. When we pulled away, there was no need for words. We didn't need to talk about it, didn't need to discuss what came next. We had already made our choice. The world might not understand, but we did. And that was enough. Hand in hand, we walked away from the registry office, stepping into the future, knowing that whatever came next, we would face it together.